Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series where we bring you closer to some of the world's most distinguished scholars and their impactful ideas. I'm Deepak, your host from India. Across classrooms, film festivals, and global research forums, Dr. Jülide Etem's work tells a powerful story about how media shapes societies and gives voice to those often unheard. From her academic journey across Turkey, Italy, and the United States to her role today as an assistant professor at the University of Virginia, she has consistently explored the intersection of media history, documentary storytelling, and questions of race and ethnicity. Her scholarship, published in leading international journals and presented at premier academic platforms, examines how institutions use media not just to inform, but to influence, transform, and redefine public discourse. Beyond academia, her work comes alive through the lens of a camera and the depth of human stories. As a media producer, Professor Etam has documented critical social movements from protests against authoritarianism to advocacy around refugee rights, disability justice, and immigration reform. Her films and projects have reached audiences through festivals, policy circles, and cultural institutions, amplifying voices that demand to be heard. Equally dedicated to teaching, she has inspired thousands of students at leading universities to think critically, engage with intersectional perspectives, and create meaningful work within the media landscape. Today on Business Talk, we have the privilege of engaging with her work as she unpacks the ideas behind her book, Film Diplomacy, a media history of Turkey-US relations. Let's welcome her to the conversation. Professor Jülide Etem, it's a pleasure to have you with us. The honor is entirely ours.
Thank you so much for having me here, Deepak. I really appreciate this.
Thank you. Professor, what drew you to film and media studies as your primary area of research? And how did your interest evolve into examining the role of institutions in using media to transforming social impact?
So I grew up in Istanbul, where different histories, cultures, and political narratives are often layered onto the same streets and buildings. And I became interested early on in the gap between a place, how a place is lived by the people who know it through their daily experiences, and also how it is represented to others. And film gave me a way to think about that gap. I was first drawn to cinema because of its emotional power, colors, cinematography, all of that, and its ability to bring us to lives and places beyond our immediate experiences. But my research gradually let me question beyond the images on the screens. In the archives, I encountered films made as well as circulated by government agencies, foundations, missionary organizations, and corporations. And I began to see how films functioned as tools through institutions that decided which stories were worth telling, how they should be translated, how they were shown, and what audiences were expected to learn from them. Realizing that slowly changed the questions that I asked. I care deeply about what films mean, I analyze them, and I'm interested in how they make viewers feel. And I also question who financed them, who is behind the scene, who authorized them, how they reach their audiences, what kinds of social and political change they were intended to produce. So this is also what drew me to the question of transformative social impact. And as you know, media can create understanding, help make neglected experiences visible or invisible, and bring institutions and publics into new relationships. But it can also reproduce inequality and present institutional priorities to some extent as common sense. And studying these histories help us recognize both possibilities and approach the use of media for social change with perhaps greater accountability as well as imagination.
Professor, you frame the US-Turkey alliance as something screened rather than simply signed. What does this shift in perspective reveal about the hidden power of media in diplomacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's think it this way. A treaty often tells governments what they agreed to, right? And a film tells people what that agreement is supposed to sound like or look like. The US-Turkey alliance was certainly built around and through military agreements, economic assistance, NATO membership, and diplomatic negotiations. But those agreements also had to become meaningful to ordinary people. They had to be converted into stories of friendship, progress, security, and purpose. One of the films that opens my book, Turkey Middle East Bridgeland, follows two boys, Mike from the United States and Ahmet from Turkey. And as they travel through Turkey, they see modern roads, buses, schools, and historical sites. At the end, they exchange gifts, they shake hands, and their friendship becomes a warm, a simple image of the relationship between the two countries that may look innocent, but it is doing a sophisticated diplomatic work. A complex and unequal geopolitical relationship is transformed into the emotionally appealing story of two children becoming friends. So when I say the alliance was screened, I mean that it was made visible. It also gained a physical form of a film reel that could be played again and again. So media help turn policy objectives within national and international relations into common sense. So diplomacy did not happen only behind closed doors, it was narrated in public, where films helped determine which alliances felt trustworthy and which interventions appeared benevolent.
Professor, educational films are often seen as neutral or informative. What did your research uncover about their role as instruments of persuasion and ideological shaping?
Yeah, that's another great question. The word educational has always carried a reassuring quality. It often tells us this is here to help you, you can trust it. And that is precisely what that is precisely what makes educational films so powerful, right? Hearing that adjective right before film, educational, it just makes it so trustworthy. It's just brings that reassuring quality. My research shows that education and persuasion were intertwined. They often work together. These films taught viewers how to protect their health, improve their agricultural production, operate machinery, or even understand one another within a country or people in another country. Excuse me. At the same time, they communicated ideas about what a modern family should look like, what kind of economy a nation should build, which political systems it should support, which countries it should be, which countries should be seen as leaders, right? As early as 1933, an American diplomatic report described educational cinema in Turkey both as an underdeveloped field as well as a potential medium of propaganda. So officials understood that entering a classroom also meant entering a place of trust. The most effective persuasion did not always have to announce itself. It could arrive as a practical lesson, a friendly story, an expert explanation, or a demonstration of how to use a tractor. That doesn't necessarily mean that the information was always false or harmful, but many educational films genuinely offered useful information. The deeper question here, what we really need to question here is the agency, the intent. Who defined the lesson? What worldview traveled through this kind of information that these films communicated? And what alternatives remain outside the frame and why? Who did that serve to? What purposes that serve to?
Professor, how did this film move beyond classrooms and become part of everyday public life in both Turkey and the United States?
Yeah, what surprised me the most was how mobile this whole system was, how mobile these films were. In Turkey, educational films appeared in schools, libraries, but also in public squares, hospitals, prisons, churches, factories, theaters, community and cultural centers dating. I covered the time period between 1930 and 1986. So throughout that time period, they were circulating all over. And mobile cinema units, these are buses that had projectors. They carried projectors and film reels into rural areas where they rarely had electricities, and sometimes reaching communities where audiences had rarely or never encountered mobile pictures before. So imagine a projector arriving in a village at night. And imagine like seeing a screen and families are gathering, girls and boys, they're all sitting and they see this machine and it's projecting images, they're moving images. So that whole experience was new. It was part of their understanding of what modernization meant and could mean. So in these spaces, people were not only receiving information, they were encountering the spectacle of modern technology and the institutions that brought it to them. So in the United States, films about Turkey also circulated through schools, universities, churches, missionary networks, educational distributors. Had them circulating across the country. So here we don't have like one system working just in one nation, but it was moving transnationally. So they were teaching American audiences also how to imagine Turkey. And often, as a country moving from tradition toward the West. And missionary films also showed American supporters what their institutions were doing abroad, helping to raise funds and recruit personnel. So the circulation moved in both direction. It wasn't unidirectional, it was bilateral. And a film's power came not only from what it's contained, but also where it's exhibited, who introduced it, and how often it was shown, and what conversations it led to.
Professor, your book highlights a transition from missionary-driven film efforts to modernization agendas. How did this shift redefine the purpose of media in international relations?
It was not a clean break. It was perhaps a change in language, institutional ambition, and also scale, I would say. American missionaries were among the earliest groups to build educational film networks across the globe. They were, working in China, in India, in Turkey, and they carried projectors to schools, hospitals, prisons, open public spaces. They presented films about health, agriculture, science, education, while also hoping to communicate Christian values and strengthen the standing of their institutions. And over time, governments and international organizations recognized the power of the networks that missionaries had helped create. So United States Information Services, also known as United States Information Agency, UNESCO, Ministry of National Education of Turkey, they all developed a much larger and more systematic infrastructure. So the language slowly shifted, and instead of primarily discussing, let's say, salvation, institutions spoke about development, productivity, public health, national progress, and modernization became a key term that brought all these distinct institutions to come together and collaborate. And of course, some underlying assumptions remained familiar. Like an institution identified a population as needing improvement and used media to develop a preferred way of living. So media became more than a tool for convincing people to do things. It became a tool for shaping public opinion. It became a tool for informing them about policy objectives within a nation and also outside of the borders of that nation. They used films to promote health campaigns. They used films to show farming techniques. They used films to shape people's understanding of national identity. And they also used films to make a geopolitical alliance appear beneficial. And the ambition moved, in a sense, from changing individual souls to reorganizing mass audiences.
Professor, in what ways did educational cinema contribute to promoting free market capitalism and countering communism during the Cold War?
Yeah, I would say capitalism was not presented as an abstract economic theory in these films. It's often had a human face. It often had a practical implementation of what it meant. It appeared as I keep going to this tractor example. It appeared as a tractor moving across fields, increasing agricultural productivity, so improving production, and you could see it in the way that roads were developed, like modern roads were built with that example that I mentioned earlier. So all of these different industries opened up new markets. And it also showed viewers that individuals, families, societies were enjoying the rewards of the technological progress. So films such as, these are like Marshall Plan sponsored films, Village Tractor, Yusuf and His Plow, these films made an economic model visible through everyday life experiences. The message was that prosperity would follow if people embraced machinery, expert knowledge, productivity, Western developments, and Western practices. So American assistance was presented as partnership, and they were communicating how the Marshall Plan policy could help improve living standards. And in order to do that, people had to learn how to drive tractors. So that could have helped them improve their living standards and also the national productivity, right? So going back to your question, communism was framed as the force standing in the way of that future. Sometimes that message was direct. In other cases, it was included into stories about religion, freedom, work, or morality. So the United States Information Services sponsored a series of films about Nasreddin Hoja, and these films transformed a beloved figure into a messenger for anti-communist ideas. Other films contrasted Christianity, with atheism, presented Islam and capitalism as compatible partners. And so people do not build political commitments not only by reading policy documents, right? They also build them through stories about um, family, dignity, faith, and work. So educational cinema translated the Cold War economic order into those more familiar terms.
Professor, you argue that these films advance a racialized vision of progress. Could you elaborate on how whiteness function as an invisible standard within these narratives?
Right, yeah. So I think of whiteness in these films as an invisible measuring stick. It was never limited to skin color. It was a larger system of assumptions about who appeared modern, rational, educated, technologically capable, and entitled to lead. And Western institutions were often positioned as the source of knowledge and progress here. So non-Western societies, meanwhile, were shown as developing, catching up, or needing guidance. That hierarchy could be communicated through something as simple as who served as the expert, who narrated the story, who possessed the technology, and who was expected to learn. So here, Turkey occupied a particular position. Turkish officials and cultural producers wanted the nation to be recognized as modern, Western, and European. So films emphasized education, technological advancement, and connections to civilizations. Those images aim to distance Turkey from racialized ideas of a backward Middle East. But that entry into a privileged category came at a cost. Turkey's modernization was often demonstrated by separating it from Arabs, visibly religious Muslims, rural communities, and others marked as less modern. Whiteness, therefore, operated as an aspiration, a form of geopolitical belonging, and a system of exclusion, all without having to name itself.
Professor, how did Turkish state institutions use film to construct a unified national identity? And what were the consequences of marginalized communities?
Mhm. So every nation needs stories to share and make sense of its history, people, and culture. And the issue begins when these stories carry only one voice. Through the Educational Film Center and other state institutions, Turkey produced thousands of films about history, geography, agriculture, health, science, culture, and economy. These films helped audiences imagine themselves as part of one national community. They promoted belonging, patriotism, a shared language, a common historical narrative, and also a confidence in the modern state. But that unity was often built through selective visibility. The ideal citizen presented in many of these films was Turkish speaking, especially someone who uses Istanbul Turkish, modern, loyal to the state, able-bodied, heterosexual, positioned within a dominant Sunni Muslim national framework, even when the state described itself as secular. So communities that complicated that image could be reduced or left out, right? So Kurds, Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, Jews, Alevis, Afro-Turks, Assyrians, and other communities did not appear in these films. And their stories were not mentioned in these films. And that absence is not insignificant. It performs political work. When people do not see or hear themselves represented as part of the nation, they receive a message about whose story history matters and whose differences must be concealed or forgotten or changed or corrected. So film did not simply reflect national identity, it helped produce it. So silence was part of that message.
Professor, the book draws on newly declassified archives. Was there a particular discovery that significantly changed your understanding of media's role in diplomacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. There were many materials that were very surprising, but maybe perhaps one that stood out for me was finding the blueprint before the building of the Educational Film Center existed. In 1933, Eugene Hinkle, an American diplomat in Ankara, prepared a report about film in Turkey. And at that moment, he described educational cinema as practically unknown. And he described it as as a potential propaganda medium. He imagined a lone film library in a center such as Ankara and noted that films could provide the United States with a pathway into Turkish schools and encourage cooperation with the government. So, nearly 2 decades later, the Educational Film Center was created in Ankara through collaboration among the Turkish Ministry of National Education, UNESCO, and United States Information Service. So it became a major national institution that produced and circulated thousands of films, and that connection changed how I understood diplomacy. It showed me that media was not an addition to foreign and national policy. Officials were thinking strategically about educational access, distribution systems, partnerships, and influence long before the infrastructure was fully developed. So the archives also showed the limits of that power. Turkish viewers did not simply observe what they saw. They questioned the films, compared their promises with the social and economic realities of their lives. So institutions could build screens and shape messages, but they could not completely control what audiences would see, understand, and keep with them.
Professor, you describe film as a form of infrastructure. Can you explain how cinema operated not just as content, but as a system that organized institutions and shaped citizens?
Yeah. So I think like what I mean by infrastructure here is that cinema was never just a film on the screen in a movie theater. It was an entire network of people, institutions, technologies, laws, and spaces. A film reached an audience only because many different actors made that possible. For example, American agencies, United States Information Services supplied and sponsored films. Turkish ministries uh, revisited them. In some cases, they accepted these films. In other cases, they rejected them because they didn't match their vision of the nation. And in other cases, that they adapted many of them, and they were selective to match their priorities. And here, translators, voiceover actors, teachers, film officers, they all reshape the material for their particular audiences.
Professor,
Uh,
yeah,
oh, yeah.
please go ahead.
Okay. And so film libraries were actually really useful here because they stored and circulated the reels, and mobile cinema units carried projectors to schools and villages and like other public spaces. So researchers also interviewed the viewers. They gathered their reactions. They used that information for their various goals. So here, film did at least two things at once. It connected institutions like UNESCO, United States Information Services, Ministry of National Education, schools, local communities. It also connected policy to everyday life. So, and most of the times, what connects all these films is this is like a discourse around modernization. They demonstrate what a modern citizen was expected to do, how they could use agricultural technologies, how they could contribute to national economy, and how they could support political and economic order promoted by the state and its international partners. And I would say that's why the logistics matter here as much as the images. So power operated through the projectors, the translation, the film libraries, the exhibition sites, and audience surveys. So film made government policy uh, visible and ordinary, and it turned larger political goals into lessons about farming, health, and work into practical instructions for how people were expected to live.
Professor Etam, to conclude this episode, I would like to end with a final question. Looking at today's digital and social media landscape, do you see parallels with the historical use of film in shaping geopolitical narratives and public opinion?
Absolutely. There are so many parallels. I think the difference I would describe is in scale. Um, the technology is always advancing, and so are emerging media technologies. So the scale of how these things emerge and operate is happening a lot faster, and and the reach of these technologies are bigger in numbers when we compare them to these historical mediums. But there are so many parallels.
Dr. Jülide Etem, thank you so much for sharing such thoughtful insights and perspective on the intersection of media, history, and diplomacy. Your work offers a powerful lens to understand how narratives shape nations and global relationships. It has been a privilege having you with us on Business Talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to join you.